welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, I'm Zoe and I make lifestyle videos about books, beauty, and sustainability, and today I'm going to be doing my November reading wrap-up. So November ended up being a month where I read a lot of books about race, or I read books by people of color, and this wasn't something that I originally set out to do, but it just kind of like happened to be like that. I think a whole bunch of books from my library that I had requested as audiobooks ended up becoming available kind of all at the same time, and they all revolved around race issues, or like I said, were by people of color. So again, not something that I had intended to do, but not something I'm mad at either. So without further ado, let's just dive on in. So the first audiobook that I read this month was The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. And this book is about the main character, Star, who witnesses her best friend being shot by a cop, and then all of the fallout and consequences of that event. There's also a movie adaptation of this book that I'm really excited to watch. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. It's been really busy, but this book was an immediate 5 out of 5 stars for me. I thought it was so well done, in the sense that like I was reading this story and I couldn't help but feel like I've heard this story before, like I've read this story. It definitely mirrors some of the things that we see happening in the media today, and I think Thomas was able to touch a lot of different areas and a lot of different issues. I think in particular, Thomas did a really good job with the character of Haley and some of the white fragility that she holds. Overall, I just think that the story was like extremely well crafted. I think this is a story that should also be taught in schools. I know at least some of the schools in my area definitely have this in their curriculums. Yeah, but overall, yeah, I just think this is an incredible book that everyone should read. The next audiobook I read was White Fragility by DiAngelo. This one is a non-fiction book that specifically addresses the topic of white fragility and sort of like racism from the white person's point of view, or at least like this is a book about race that kind of specifically targets white people as an audience, and it sort of talks about how white people's inability to take constructive criticism or to tolerate being called out on their racism, or even having conversations about race at all, is detrimental to anti-racist work. I thought this book was really well done, and it felt like DiAngelo had a lot of research and personal experience to be able to back up her arguments. I definitely know people who should read this book. I think it's a great starting point for white people in particular, because it addresses sort of being open to criticism and open to self-reflection, getting more comfortable with the idea that we all hold racial bias. So I just think that in reading this book, it will make any further readings or learning on race issues more effective. That being said, I did find that this book does really focus, again, like I said, it's like race issues, but from the point of view of white people, or at least for a white audience. So it is very limited in its scope of what it talks about. It's really focusing on like this one concept of white fragility. So is it the be all to end all book? Absolutely not. But like I said, I think it's a great starting point. The next audiobook I read was Me and White Supremacy by Layla F. Saad. So this one is another nonfiction book, but it's intended to be a workbook and sort of a book that helps you self-reflect, as opposed to just something you would read cover to cover. So I feel like the format of an audiobook probably wasn't the best for this, because I didn't have the questions in front of me. Like you would have to write them down in order to be able to do the exercises, unless you would like pause and just sit there and like think about it. But I think writing it is kind of like better. That being said, I think this book and then the next book I mentioned were both really, really great tools for helping me self-reflect and look back on my behaviors with like a new pair of eyes. And so yeah, I would definitely recommend this book, but I would probably recommend it more in the physical version. Additionally, I know that this was originally like an Instagram challenge, so you could always like go back and refer to the Instagram posts, but yeah, I would probably lean more towards like getting the physical book so that you're able to write it out and participate in the activities as you go along. The next audiobook I read was So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo. So this one I particularly liked because, unlike the first two that I mentioned, this one really was more from a person of color's point of view and talking about like their experiences, and it wasn't so much like targeted at white people or from the point of view of a white person. So I really appreciated that. I found that was unique compared to the other two. And I think all of these books not only help me educate myself and help me interact with the world in a better way, but in addition, I feel like they all arm me with arguments so that if somebody says something that's offensive, I'm able to point it out in a way that's constructive. Because sometimes in the heat of the moment, like, you can get so upset by something that you end up being frazzled. So when you have this knowledge and you have these arguments, they're there for when you need them. And I did get some like critical race theory education throughout my degree, but it wasn't something that I focused a lot on. I ended up studying oppression more from the standpoint of like LGBTQ2+ issues and things like that. So race issues are kind of like a hole in my education, and I think like the films I watched at the time and like being able to read all these books now is really helping me to fill that gap and become a more educated human being. The next audiobook I read, and I'm only realizing now that this was a very like audiobook heavy month. I did read physical books, I just didn't finish any, unfortunately. So this is Wow, No Thank You by Samantha Irby. And Samantha Irby is a queer Black author, and this book I can only describe as like a semi-autobiographical comedy book. And for some reason it very much gives me like BuzzFeed vibes. I don't know why. Maybe it's that Samantha Irby reminds me of Jasmine from BuzzFeed in particular, but I feel like it's kind of the same brand of humor that you sort of see in those videos and that you see from Jasmine specifically. This one wasn't my favorite, and I think that's because it almost felt to me like this book was trying to be just a little bit too relatable, a little bit too marketed towards millennials, and so I think that just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And maybe that's just because I'm not the target demographic for this book. So I would definitely recommend that you check it out and see if you do jive with it, because I think it was a good book. I just think it probably like wasn't for me, but I still feel like there are some people who would just like absolutely love this and think it's hilarious. So yeah, like would recommend, but just like maybe not for me. And last but not least, I read 2 ebooks. So we have Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls 2 and Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls 3, which focuses on immigrant women. And again, like I mentioned in my previous month's reading wrap up, I do really enjoy this series of books. I'm really glad it exists. I'm not always thrilled with every single person who's featured in the books. For example, J.K. Rowling is featured in one of these books, and I think we kind of all know about the social fall of J.K. Rowling, so that's not great, but that's just kind of the danger of like publishing a book about a contemporary figure, is that they can go on to do terrible things, so that's not really the fault of the authors. There's a couple of instances like that where I'm like, oh yeah, okay, these women are like really important in history, but they've also done some not so great things. So that's something to keep in mind. I do really enjoy these books. It's always really cool when I recognize some of the figures, and sometimes I will be reading a story and then I realize like, oh my god, like I've heard of this, I had just never like really known the person by name or by their face, and so it's kind of cool to be made more aware of something you were vaguely familiar with, and then of course like learning about people who are completely new, you've never heard of it all, you're like, wow, aren't women great? And these books do include stories of trans women, because trans women are women. So again, I just really appreciate that. And I would definitely recommend these books both for someone who's looking for a gift for a child in their lives, or if they just want to read it for themselves, because I definitely think this is something that an adult could read as well. So those were all the books I read in November. Please let me know if you have any other recommendations of books that are either by people of color, about people of color, or that cover race issues. I'd be more than happy to hear them and try and feature them in my TBR for next year. It's definitely something I'm conscious of and I'm going to put active effort into reading. Yeah, and also let me know what you read in November or what you plan on reading in December. I want to hear all about it in the comments. Otherwise, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you here next time. Bye!